Welcome to this video. As I've said in the last video, we will now install a package called Swagger to create some documentation about our API, which we can also use to test it. So never forget that we are developing two things, right? Because this is a full stack course. We are developing a RESTful API and a front end using Angular. At the very first days, we have only focused on Angular. And right now we are only focusing on ASP. In the end, we will combine everything and connect everything together. So for now, let's just focus on ASP. Great. So go ahead to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and then Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. On the top left side, click on Browse, not installed, and search for swashbuckle.asp.NET Core, right? And you can see Swagger tools for documenting API built on ASP.NET Core. We will use that package, swashbuckle.asp.NET Core. Now select it, click on your project or select your project and hit on install. Now afterwards, move to program.cs. And here at builder.services, we simply go ahead and in the next line we add builder.services.swagger.gen.add swagger.gen. So this is the first line of code we have to add. And when we build the application, scroll a little bit down, you can see this. Let me zoom out a little bit right. And when we build the application here in line 8, right afterwards, we go ahead and say app.useSwagger and then call useSwagger UI. Now we will see in a second what this does. Save it and let's start the application. Just copy your port, which is for the ASP application, right? So we're gonna copy it and then we simply add swagger/index.html. Now let's move to that page. So again, it's localhost, then your ASP port, then swagger/index.html. And now you can see your documentation of your code and you can even test it, right? So this is what Swagger is offering us. So here we got our flight endpoint, which is a get HTTP endpoint, and you can even try it out, right? But here is some example of how it's looking like, of how it looks like. You got that ID, airline, price, string, departure, etc. So this is an example of how an request response could look like. Let's go ahead, let's try it out, right? When we execute it, we can see that we get all the information right here of our example data. So once we click here on try it out, a request will get sent to that endpoint and we can then see the response here in the body. You can also see that 200 here, which is the status code. 200 means okay, so there was no issue. Let's scroll a little bit down. You can also see our both read models here. So let's open them up. You can see how we are using it. Now, why is that so important? For sure, we can use that to test our API and to provide other developers or users who want to implement our API a good way on how our API looks like. But we also need that, and now this is why we're doing it. We need it because Angular needs to know how the API, the backend API, looks like, because we want to use a tool in Angular which automatically builds the client-side code. So just to get that right, we are in Angular, okay? And we got 10 flights in our backend, let's say database. Now Angular needs to get that information. Right now we have hard coded it in Angular 2, but we will remove it. So Angular is only for displaying values, right? So in Angular we need some sort of client-side code which will then connect to our API to get search results from our database, for example. So this is the final connection. Now, we really don't want to write a lot of TypeScript code from scratch just to write the connection to our API. What we can do instead is really professional. We can just generate some OpenAPI standard API right here, right? So this is following the OpenAPI standard. And we can then switch over to Angular later on, simply use a plugin which will then check for that OpenAPI, which we can see right here. And depending on that information, the client-side code of Angular will automatically get built. So no worries, we will definitely get to that, but I want you to know why we are doing that right here. So we are not finished yet. We really want Angular to be able to connect, but therefore we need to define a new OpenAPI server with a URL so that we can connect Angular to that server, to that API version. All right, let's click on that Swagger JSON link right here. Now you can see in JSON format our API, right? This is exactly what our API in JSON format looks like. So we have a path, which is /flight. There is a get endpoint. Here's an example get response. So depending on all of that information, Angular will be able to create some client-side code, which is then connecting to that database. And we don't have to really write a lot TypeScript. And that's what you want to do, right? There are a lot of tools which can help you write faster code, better code, and even more secure code. So what we just saw was generated by the Swagger tool we just installed. It's called OpenAPI specification. It defines a public contract for documenting REST APIs. The purpose of that contract is to be both human and machine readable. So you as a person, you can read that because it's nice and clear readable, but also a machine can read and interpret it. So a piece of software can translate it to user interfaces like Swagger UI is doing. So that's just what we saw. We have that OpenAPI in the background, and Swagger is just taking that and rendering a user interface, which we can use for testing, for example, right? Or it can translate it to other pieces of code, high-level web clients, exactly what we will do in Angular. An example of that code can be generated from the spec. But we will take a look at that in action tomorrow, because then we will auto-generate the Angular client API from this API specification that we have just seen. So here just another infographic about, on the left side you have that Swagger user interface, and it's depending on the OpenAPI document that we have right here, which is exactly our developed API. Okay, now one final last change and we are done. As I said, to make it work in Angular in the end, we need to define an OpenAPI server. So let's configure one real quick. Here in add Swagger gen, go ahead and inside of that braces, let's go ahead and say that we want to add a new server to that configuration, right? So we go ahead and say configuration add server. I mean, all of these are pretty straightforward expressions. So add Swagger generation, where this C means actually, and this C means, well, Swagger gen options, let's call it config, and config goes to config add a server, new OpenAPI server, and it has a description and some more information. Let me just zoom out a little bit. New Microsoft OpenAPI server. We can also bring that into a using directive right here. So just a second, that's nicer, using Microsoft OpenAPI models, then we can get rid of it. So new OpenAPI server, and now we can define two things. First one is a description, for example, description equals to development server. And the second one, and that's the most important one, is the URL. So now pay attention because it could be a little bit different for you. Go ahead and write that URL just like I do now. https://localhost, and now your personal port for HTTPS. Go into properties on the right side, then launch settings, search for profiles, and then you can see application URL, and this is your port, whatever is here for you. For me, it's 7208. You can see it's for development. And now I switch back to paste it here. And that's all we have to do. So https://localhost:7280 or whatever your port is. Let's start our application one more time. Move again to your Swagger index.html. So localhost, your port, /swagger/index.html. And now you can see that we have that server here, right? So on this server we can use in our Angular project now and connect everything together. So click here on Swagger. You can also see that here, servers, right? So it just got added. Exactly the information that you just have defined. Great. So now we have set up Swagger and OpenAPI in a way that we can use it in our Angular project. So tomorrow we will exactly do that. We will switch over to our Angular project and make use of that API we have just created. I hope you had a great day and learned a lot of new stuff, and I see you tomorrow in the next video.